Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Richard Bird. Richard is the Chief Security Officer at Traceable AI, a leading API security and observability company. Richard, thank you for joining us today for our Risk Management Show interview.
Of course, thank you for having me on. I truly appreciate it.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Richard, can you tell us a short story about your career path? What brought you to where you are at now, and what you guys at Traceable AI are up to these days?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very fortunate personally that I've lived basically two careers. So I spent 20 plus years in the corporate world, and 16 years of those or so were in banking and financial services. I worked at JP Morgan Chase for about 11 years, and I had roles in both IT operations. So I dealt with a lot of regulations, early days of Dodd-Frank and Graham Leach. And then I moved into information and security or cybersecurity, and dealt with a lot of regulations there too. And I had the opportunity to leave the corporate world about 5 or 6 years ago and move to the solution side. I spent my first couple of years in digital identity, and then I started seeing trends in APIs that suggested it was going to be the new frontier of security, and had some conversations with a company that I had a relationship with, happened to be Traceable. And Traceable has been pioneering API security now for the better part of almost 3 years after coming out of stealth. And I'm really interested personally, intellectually, where API security is going. But what's fascinating is over the last 6 to 12 months, the headline news stories about API attacks and API security exploits and breaches have confirmed that I may have made a decent career choice in joining Traceable, because unfortunately, even Gartner is calling out that APIs have become the largest attack vector for the bad guys, just in the span of really only about 12 to 24 months. So it's been fascinating to see that our regulators here in the United States have moved to already address this issue. But there's definitely a lot of change going on in banking industry as it relates to security.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so today I think we will discuss this topic, how CISOs, CEOs, and governance, risk, and compliance leaders in all FDIC-insured financial institutions can align with the latest API security component. So it's kind of a lot of abbreviation, so don't make me kind of because it's a full month of FDIC and FFIEC compliance mandate. So maybe can you explain us what are the key components of the FFIEC API security compliance mandates? Can you explain it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first, let's talk a little bit about how banking regulation structures are constructed in the United States. So the FFIEC was established in 1979. And they're actually a joint agency. So all of the major federal monetary policy organizations like the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FFIEC kind of serves as the central clearinghouse for the activation and administration of regulations in banks. So every year, banks in the United States have to pass a cyber assessment test, a CAT, if you will, another acronym. And so just real quick, the history of this is very fascinating, because if we go back to about 2011, there was a regulatory requirement that came out that was called the FFIEC guidance for access and authorization. And I'm very familiar with it because I was one of the contributors to it that many years ago as a banking representative to the government agencies. And that requirement or that regulation hadn't been updated for a decade. And in August of 2021, the FFIEC printed a new guidance document, and that guidance document had a requirement for all banks to have an inventory and a risk assessment of their APIs. How many APIs do they have? What do those APIs do? Who, I guess, nominatively owns those APIs? Except it was buried in a regulation, and it was literally only about 3 to 5 words highlighting APIs in a document that in the prior 10 years had never even mentioned APIs. So when we got to 2022, a number of banks in the United States went through that annual assessment that I mentioned, and they failed. And it raised a tremendous amount of concern because at that point, many banks realized that there was a new requirement that they hadn't quite fully understood. As you can imagine, as it is around the world, our regulators sometimes don't communicate well when changes happen. And because of this kind of confluence of events, poorly communicated change, a change to a long-established regulatory guideline, and then the need to actually take action and evaluate your API inventory and API risk, we saw a lot of activity happen in the United States in 2022 around failed audits for understanding your API exposure, and then a lot of activity trying to remediate or mitigate that audit finding in the form of calling on companies like Traceable to provide that visibility, transparency, and understanding of the APIs that you were exposed to. So it's been a very rapid series of events when we kind of think about how time moves in banking, which is relatively slowly. We've had about 18 months of a lot of activity. And one of the things that's really interesting is going back to what I mentioned about, the number of breaches and exploits that have happened through APIs. It's very clear that the federal government is already considering more prescriptive requirements around APIs simply because of the outcomes, the bad outcomes that we've already seen happening in a number of organizations such as T-Mobile and Twitter and Uber and a number of companies that have made headline news.
So if we consider now, what are the most important aspects of an API security strategy for FFIEC-insured financial institutions?
Yeah, the approach that the FFIEC took in establishing the regulations really kind of matches best practices for the development of programs in banking historically, which is the most important thing is to understand what your exposure is. So the requirement that the regulators put in place was understand your inventory, understand all APIs that you're currently exposed to. And that's a big universe, right? Because there's been 10 years of API development with very little in the way of security framework or guidance around this capability. And it's understandable why. APIs unleash massive amounts of business value that have been tied up in systems that have been difficult to integrate or data stores that are difficult to access. So there's massive amounts of business value being unlocked with APIs. Unfortunately, it was done with without a lot of adult supervision. I don't mean to sound trite about it, but without much in the way of security controls. So APIs are propagated, to the tune of thousands, if not tens of thousands within, particularly within banks. And so the FFIEC has said, get your arms around all of those APIs, understand what they do. And then the next step is understand what the risk of those APIs are relative to the exposure of public or confidential information, the exposure of financial transaction information. So really what the government is mandating, and what is a very, very good first step for all companies, regardless of whether you're a bank or not, is to understand the landscape of the risk that you're exposed to by understanding your inventory, who those are assigned to, who's responsible for maintaining and updating. Interesting statistic, a number of analyses have come out and said that, APIs have been developed long enough without any security controls that in many cases, 30% of the APIs that reside within a company's four walls, 30% of them are sitting unused, or they're antiquated, or they're already obsolete. And yet each one of those APIs, as long as they remain available within the system, is a potential weapon to be used by the bad guys to execute bad things. So the lack of understanding of the risk is really step number one. Get an understanding and a clarity on that inventory, on what those APIs are doing, what they should be doing, and then understanding exactly from a governance perspective who should be managing and controlling their behaviors and activities.
Fantastic. So if we look on organizations, of how can they have to ensure, or what are the possibilities to ensure that their API security approaches are up to date and secure, and what are the most important steps that, for example, CISO and professionals like CIO leaders should take into account to ensure their organizations are compliant?
Yeah, I really
more practical, yeah. More practical,
yeah,
maybe organization-wide.
You bet. I really like you, pinpointing kind of the practical realities of this, right? When we look at, when I talk with CISOs and chief security officers and heads of risk functions in the banking industry, the very first conversation I have with them is are you recognizing that your current tool set is incapable of allowing you to fix this problem? In the internet application world, we have depended heavily upon web application firewalls, and we've depended heavily on web or gateways, API gateways. And those are really just only traffic routers, and like an old firewall, they just say, I won't allow this traffic in, or I will allow this traffic in. APIs are, much more complex than that in terms of their functional behaviors. They're very transactional. So every API is written specifically to do a thing. And that's helpful because in talking with CISOs and CSOs, what I say is, it's like, look, what you want to do is you need to have cataloging and automatic discovery. And that auto discovery is going to, seek and find all APIs that are operating within your environment. And then you need to be able to do that risk assessment piece, which is have a clear understanding, which, machine learning and a number of technologies that Traceable has takes care of for you. Understand what that API is supposed to be doing. And you've been associated with risk for a long time, right? It's never when something is doing something that it's supposed to be doing that we're worried. It is always when something is doing something that it should not be doing that risk is introduced into the equation. So first steps, very tactically, a solution capability, a platform capability that allows you to catalog and auto discover all of those APIs that are that you're exposed to in your environment. And then the ability to divine through the actual code of those APIs, the DNA of those APIs, what those APIs should be doing. And then that begins the launch pad for companies to be able to understand in real time as APIs are being used, whether that API is being abused or leveraged to do bad things by bad actors. So it really is a maturity curve. It really is a stepwise process. But the very first part of the conversation in tackling this problem is understanding that today's current state solutions that have been typically used for API management or API operations are insufficient in being able to manage API security, which is where companies like Traceable now have found our business booming, I guess is the best way to put it. We're providing the tools and the capabilities to be able to do those first steps, as well as the threat analytics and threat intelligence steps that come in the next stage of maturity.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's drill down a little bit to your specific application and company. What are the business cases that your solution solves the best in the eyes of the customer? And can you give some examples of user cases that it solves? So
Yeah.
you already, of course, told them, but maybe some more practical.
You bet. And this is a really important aspect of the conversation, because one of the things that gets lost in the conversation about APIs is the thinking that APIs are just simply providing a connective tissue between applications. The reality is that when we think about the history of technology virtualization, we go back nearly 15 years when AWS started the commercial availability of cloud service providers. We really virtualized the operating systems, and then we virtualized servers, and then we virtualized firewalls. Well, now the evolutionary pathway has taken us to virtualizing everything in the application layer. The downside to that is that all of the previous attacks that used to be available in each one of the respective layers in database and network and firewall and all of that, they can now all be done in the application layer through APIs. So when you think about use cases, too often the conversation switches to things just like very specific, like application security. But the fraud and theft and cybercrime activities that we've seen go way beyond that, right? So the best example that I can give is we recently, with a customer, we're seeing some very odd behaviors relative to traffic that was coming in from an IP here in the United States. And as we, divined the underlying design and what the API should be doing, we found some inconsistencies. And as we took a look at it, what we discovered is there was an actor here in the United States who was selling access to sanctioned countries around the world. And these countries included Syria, they included North Korea, Russia, and what we were seeing was a huge amount of inbound traffic trying to create new accounts, basically fraudulent account creation, using tons of previously stolen, personal information from, any number of breaches around the world. That information was being used to create account creation requests in these sanctioned nations, being routed through the United States IP provider, who was facilitating the crime, and then landing squarely at the front door of these companies who were having to try and figure out whether or not this was real traffic, real customer acquisition or not, right? So fraudulent account creation rarely comes into people's minds when they think about APIs, but most companies are using APIs to create their account creation processes for brand new customers. We've seen things like internal APIs being used by bad actors inside of a company to engage in content piracy. In the case of media companies, we've seen in the banking world, we've seen not just fraudulent account creation, but fraudulent account takeover, where you're using APIs to leverage the capabilities in a browser, which used to be the old method of actor in the middle or man in the middle attacks. Now you can do that with an API. And the last one that I'll say is that I think is the most troubling is we frequently see customers who are being attacked by bots using APIs to do the equivalent of a denial of service attack against their online channels. Now, this is really interesting because 15 years ago, I lived through massive attempts at denial of service attacks, and it used to take a lot of work for the bad guys to do that. Right? They used to have to assemble tens of millions of email clients, and then they would launch them against your network. Nobody needs to do that anymore because I can do it with one API. I can do it with an army of bots, and I can take down your digital interface. And here's what's really important. As we know, most companies have gone more and more digital in terms of their transactional business. So now all I have to do is take out your online channel, think online banking, and you're out of business. And the revenue impacts now that are being able to be achieved with the use of an API versus using all the other former complicated methods necessary to have the same result are now being leveraged by the bad actors through the application layer. So the diversity of the attack capabilities is widely misunderstood in the industry as it relates to what you're exposed to. But that's also coming into focus. Sadly, not necessarily because Traceable is doing a fantastic job of educating the market, but because the bad actors keep showing up in the headline news with the next company that's lost 70 million accounts or 16 million accounts. And that's probably a good leading off place. The other thing that's really, really important tactically to understand is if APIs are different in any singular way in relation to any previous types of attacks, it's volume and speed, right? Seeing companies losing tens upon tens of millions of accounts in a single API facilitated attack. These are numbers that are, substantially larger. And these breaches are happening substantially quicker than anything that we've seen before. And it's all through the API layer.
Yeah, it's familiar with me with regards to account creation, because I'm running this online community, globalriskcommunity.com. We have people who can subscribe from all over the world, and sometimes I see people claim that John Smith from Washington, but they are from India or from Africa, and so you will think, well, what is the idea to create such account? And I saw some patterns. Some people just go to the closest members and start to send in some spam messages. Other people start spamming, creating a blog post with some links to. So we already have some procedures for this.
Yeah, well, and if I could real quick, I will tell you, having run cybersecurity operations for a living, one of the things that I've learned, and this may sound contentious, I don't mean to offend anybody if they're a hacker, but one thing other than nation state attackers, when you look at the bad actor community of hackers, they actually are lazy. And a lot of people miss this. You know, a hacker will incline themselves towards attack methods that are the easiest, right? So if they're very, very complicated and difficult to execute, and the chances or probability of getting caught are very high, they would prefer to use something that's easier. Well, the easiest thing for them to use right now is APIs. So this is why we're seeing 200, 300, 400% growth increases year over year over the last 3 years in the use of APIs to engage in attacks, because it's an easier space for the bad guys to get what they want.
Fantastic. So let me ask you a personal point of view. For example, what is the commonly held belief in your profession or your API security world that you kind of strongly disagree with?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
What is the commonly held belief or major misconception that you strongly disagree with regards to this API security?
Oh, well, I think right now there's two in particular. Strongly held beliefs that API security is not a standalone space or a standalone capability. A lot of industry conversations going on that's saying API security belongs in AppSec, API security belongs in security operations, or the problem is that the diversity of the attack capabilities that I talked about suggest that API security is probably a new control domain in and of itself. And but a lot of companies in particular have vested interest in maintaining the status quo. So if I introduce a new control demand with securing APIs, then I represent an existential threat to companies that have suggested that they do that in the past, whether that's gateways or web application firewalls, or even organizations that are managing edge networks, or so there's a tension in the industry that leads to this misconception, the tension that there's a desire to keep API security kind of in its own space and associated with all the other previous technologies. But clearly, when we look at results and outcomes, those former technologies are not succeeding in keeping APIs safe. I think the other misconception that is very, very challenging right now is I hear it frequently from my colleagues, having been a CISO myself for a long time. I hear it frequently from my colleagues that they say, well, look, this is an overwhelming problem. Like, I don't even know where to get started. I don't even know how to handle, the exposures that I have. And the reason why I say that's a misconception is because I'm a big proponent of understanding what we should do now based upon history, evidence, and facts. And when we think about a number of years ago, the example that I always use is if I was a CISO and I walked into my data center, say 15 years ago, there was a time when I could ask a question of my network engineers and say, hey, how many firewall rules do we have? And my network engineers would look at me and say, I don't know. Right now, that was a tremendous amount of unmitigated risk, because obviously firewall rules have been capitalized on for bad things for a long time. we fixed that problem, right? Another a CEO actually that I was talking to was very IT inclined. He said, that's a great example. He goes, I remember when I was, running a major IT function, I asked how many virtual machines do we have? And nobody knew, right? And now it's impossible to conceive of a world where we don't know how many virtual machines are currently associated with running our companies and our businesses. So, this APIs, there's a ton of them. I don't know how I'm ever going to sort them out, is a misconception in itself, because we know that the pressures of either regulations or the pressures of attacks and threats are going to cause people to form up formal programs, and we're going to understand how many APIs there are, what they're doing, what they're supposed to be doing. But for right now, a lot of people are kind of in that that space of being stunned, or completely petrified to attack the problem, because they perceive that it's too big, too complicated, too messy. That will change, but for right now, it is definitely forestalling people making good decisions about how to manage their API security and exposure, and it's causing them to wait. And the thing, I'll go back to volume and speed. The thing that's really, really troubling about API risk and exposure is this is a problem. No security problems age well. This is a problem that's going to age very, very badly the longer people wait to address it, because of that exponential growth of 200, 300, and 400%. Now, like I like to say, if you don't start now, you're going to be 5 times further behind if you start next year. And that's just the reality of both mathematics and curves, right? So, getting that misconception out of the way that it's too difficult, that I can't get started, that I need to take a year to evaluate it, that is really, really critical to making progress in API security and risk management.
Fantastic. Sure, Richard. So we are almost out of time. So maybe last, that was all my questions. And perhaps if I missed something, would you like to add anything that would benefit our audience?
No, I think I think we've covered really a lot of territory about this topic, and I think that the last things that I would leave is that while it might feel like back to what I previously said, it might feel like APIs are mystical. I always remind people this isn't Hogwarts, right? Technology is just a better tractor. But when we look at APIs, there is a tendency to incline towards, okay, this is mystical. I don't understand it. It's very difficult for me to figure out, what my threats and risks are. I would just leave with your listeners that don't believe that. Don't buy that hype, right? These are solvable and understandable problems. And there are technologies and tools available, obviously with Traceable in the industry. So don't be paralyzed by the unknown, really, because here's the fact, and this is probably the best leaving off point. I've always said it, as it related to identity, and it applies equally in API security. If APIs are turning out to be the largest attack vector, as has been confirmed in both the news and with analysts, and if you're still not sure exactly what to do, the reality is that the bad guys have already figured out that APIs are the pathway to victory, and we're still debating about it. And in that time frame of debating whether or not APIs belong here or they belong here from a security standpoint and from a risk management standpoint, the bad actors are making tremendous amounts of progress and gains to their credit, while we're sitting around drinking coffee and trying to figure out what to do. This is really a call to action time period for everybody as it relates to APIs. It's like I said, if you don't get started now, you're going to be doubly behind by the time you look at it again in 90 days and triply behind by the time you look at it in 6 months.
All right, fantastic, Richard. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you and your company a successful progress, and I hope we will be in contact further with maybe next topic about our interview series.
Boris, I truly appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely.